The mountain wind swept down through the pines, cold and sharp as blades, carrying with them the scent of snow that hadn't yet fallen but promised to before nightfall. Jonas Hale, the man folks called the Mountain Bear, stood on the porch of his rough-hewn cabin, shoulders squared against the wind. His beard was thick, his hands scarred, and his heart, though few knew it, was heavier than the peaks surrounding him. He had paid for a cook. That was all, a woman to keep his fire warm and his table filled. He lived too long on salted meat and black coffee, and loneliness had settled into his bones like frost. But when the wagon creaked up the trail and stopped before his door, it wasn't just a woman stepping down. It was a widow, with eyes that had known loss, and a hand pressed protectively to the curve of her belly. Her name was Clara. Her dress was plain, her coat patched, and her boots near worn through. But when she lifted her gaze to Jonas, there was no weakness there, only quiet resolve. She thanked the driver with a soft word, then turned to the man who had summoned her. "You sent for a cook," she said, her voice steady despite the wind tugging at her veil of hair. "I can do that, but you ought to know, I am expecting a child." Jonas's jaw worked, his instincts warring within him. He was not a man of chatter nor one who welcomed surprises. He lived by order, by wood and iron, by the swing of an axe and the shot of a rifle. A pregnant woman was not what he paid for. But when her hand brushed her stomach, as if shielding the life inside, something inside Jonas shifted. "Then you'll need to eat better than I have been," he muttered. His words were rough, but not unkind. He stepped aside, and with that one gesture, Clara and her unborn child entered his world. Days passed. The cabin, once silent save for crackling logs and the scrape of boots on wood, began to fill with the aroma of stews, bread baked in iron pans, and the faint hum of a woman's voice as she worked. Jonas, unused to company, found himself watching her from the corner of his eye. She moved carefully, yet with surprising strength, hauling buckets of water, splitting small kindling when he wasn't looking, her belly never slowing her spirit. Clara never complained, not even when the nights turned so cold that frost rimmed the window panes. She tucked blankets tighter around her small bed, her hands always resting on her child as if offering a promise. And though Jonas tried to keep distance, he caught himself lingering near the table, pretending to mend harness or sharpen knives, only to listen when she spoke softly to her unborn babe. One night, as the storm roared outside, Clara found him by the fire, sitting in silence as always. She set down a bowl of stew, but instead of retreating, she sat across from him. Her eyes, lit by firelight, held a depth he had never known. "You've built a fortress here," she said quietly, glancing around the heavy logs and iron tools. "Strong enough to keep out wolves in winter. But sometimes, a man builds walls so high he keeps out the very things meant to save him." Jonas stared at her, the words striking deeper than any arrow. He had built walls, ever since the day he buried his brother in these same mountains, ever since the world taught him that love was a knife that cut deepest when you needed it most. He had closed his heart to kindness, to faith, to grace. Yet here was a woman, fragile in her body but fierce in her spirit, speaking truths he didn't want to hear. The weeks turned to months, and the child within her grew. Jonas began to notice changes not only in Clara but in himself. He found himself chopping wood faster, carrying heavier loads, hunting longer, anything to make sure she had what she needed. He began to bow his head before meals, awkwardly at first, repeating the simple prayers Clara whispered over the food. It felt strange, like putting on a coat that didn't belong to him, but little by little, it warmed him. The night Clara went into labor, the storm outside was merciless. Snow howled against the cabin walls, and fear clawed at Jonas's chest in a way he had never known, not even in battle with grizzlies or blizzards. Clara's cries echoed through the cabin, raw and piercing, while Jonas's rough hands trembled as he did everything she directed. Hours felt like lifetimes until at last, a thin cry rose above the storm, the cry of new life. Jonas held the child in his massive hands, stunned by how small, how fragile, how perfect the little creature was. Clara, exhausted but glowing with a strength beyond measure, looked up at him with tears streaming down her cheeks. "She's Grace," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "That's her name, Grace." Jonas swallowed hard, staring at the child who fit in the crook of his arm like she had always belonged there. The name struck him as if forged from heaven itself. Grace, a word he had long forgotten, a truth he never thought he would see. The mountain man who had paid for nothing more than a cook now found himself with a family, with a reason to live beyond the weight of his own solitude. And as Clara drifted to sleep, her hand resting on her child, Jonas sat awake by the fire, his walls crumbling in the presence of the two souls who had walked through them. The world outside remained wild and merciless, but inside that cabin, something stronger than storms had taken root. Jonas had sought survival, Clara had brought him grace, and in that quiet wilderness, love began to grow, as steady and unshakable as the mountains themselves. The mountain wind swept down through the pines, cold and sharp as blades, carrying with them the scent of snow that hadn't yet fallen but promised to before nightfall. Jonas Hale, the man folks called the Mountain Bear, stood on the porch of his rough-hewn cabin, shoulders squared against the wind. His beard was thick, his hands scarred, and his heart, though few knew it, was heavier than the peaks surrounding him. It had been years since he heard laughter inside these walls, years since he let anyone close. Life in the wilderness had stripped him of many things, his youth, his brother, his faith. He had learned to live with the silence, but lately the silence had begun to gnaw. He had grown weary of eating salted meat day after day, of drinking coffee so black it tasted like burnt iron, of mending his own clothes with clumsy stitches. More than that, he had grown weary of nights where the fire was his only companion. So he had sent word down the mountain, left a coin purse heavier than he would admit, and asked for a cook. A woman to tend the hearth, to keep his meals warm, maybe even soften the edges of his solitude. Nothing more. When the wagon finally creaked up his trail and stopped before his cabin, Jonas expected a stout woman with flour on her hands, maybe a widow with no family to claim her. What stepped down instead made him still as stone. The driver helped her from the bench, a woman whose dress was plain and coat patched, her boots nearly worn through. She was tall, though slender, with hair escaping its knot to blow wild in the mountain wind. But it was not her clothes nor her features that caught Jonas's breath, it was the way her hand went to her belly, instinctive and protective, the curve beneath her coat undeniable. Her eyes lifted to him, gray like the sky before a storm, and for a moment neither spoke. Then she drew herself upright with quiet dignity. "You sent for a cook," she said, her voice steady despite the cold air tugging at her breath. "I can do that, but you ought to know, I am expecting a child." Jonas's jaw worked, his instincts at war. He was a man who valued strength, usefulness, order. A pregnant woman would need care, not offer it. Yet something in her voice, not pleading, but resolute, stayed his tongue. He knew that tone. It was the sound of someone who had weathered storms before, who refused to be turned away. He looked once at her hand cradling her unborn child, then back at her face. "Then you'll need to eat better than I have been," he muttered. His words were rough, but not unkind. He stepped aside, and she entered, bringing with her the faint scent of travel, of dust and determination. Her name was Clara. She moved slowly at first, as if expecting rejection at any moment. But when she saw the state of his shelves, half-empty jars, dried meat stiff as leather, she set her jaw and began to work. Within a day, the cabin no longer smelled of smoke and bitterness but of bread baking in iron pans, of herbs steeping in broth. Clara hummed as she worked, soft melodies that filled the silence like a spring thaw filling creeks. Jonas, unused to the presence of another soul, found himself pausing at the door just to listen. But he kept his distance. His life had taught him that drawing close meant one day losing what you held. So he watched from the corners, pretending to mend tools or sharpen knives, though his ears caught every word she murmured to her unborn child as she worked. Days turned into weeks. Jonas found himself hunting longer, hauling more wood, not for himself but because he wanted the woman under his roof to lack nothing. He began to notice the small things, how Clara's hands trembled when she carried buckets of water, yet she refused to complain. How she bit her lip when the baby pressed against her ribs, yet she still managed a smile when he sat down to the table. One evening, as the storm rattled the shutters and snow began to fall in earnest, Clara joined him by the fire. She had placed a bowl of stew before him, then instead of retreating, she sat down across from him. Her eyes, lit by firelight, held a depth that unnerved him. "You've built a fortress here," she said quietly, glancing around the heavy logs and the tools that lined the walls. "Strong enough to keep out wolves in winter. But sometimes, a man builds walls so high he keeps out the very things meant to save him." Jonas stilled, his spoon hovering over the bowl. No one spoke to him that way, not in years. Her words struck like the cold wind, cutting deep. He had built walls, tall and unyielding, since the day he buried his brother beneath the pines. Since the world showed him that love could shatter a man as surely as any storm. But Clara did not look away. She was not afraid of his silence, nor of the shadow in his eyes. And though Jonas said nothing, her words echoed in him long after she went to her small bed. Winter deepened. Snow piled high against the cabin walls. Yet inside, life began to shift. Jonas found himself bowing his head at the table, awkwardly repeating the simple prayers Clara whispered over their meals. It felt strange at first, like putting on a coat too stiff for him, but over time it began to fit. The more her belly grew, the more Jonas's fear grew as well, though he never admitted it. He caught himself lying awake at night, staring at the rafters, listening for her breath in the next room. The mountains had taken too many lives. He could not bear to think of them taking hers or the child's. Then came the night when the wind shrieked like banshees outside, snow battering the windows. Clara's cry broke through the storm, sharp and urgent. Jonas leapt from his bed, his heart thundering louder than any avalanche. She was doubled over, her face pale, her hands gripping the table. "It's time," she whispered, breathless. Panic clawed at Jonas's chest. He had faced grizzlies, blizzards, men with guns in their hands, but he had never faced this. Yet Clara, through her pain, told him what to do. Boil water, tear cloth, hold her hand when the contractions came so strong she could barely breathe. Hours passed like eternities. Jonas's rough hands trembled as he obeyed her every instruction. He whispered clumsy prayers he didn't know he remembered. And at last, in the darkest hours of the night, a cry pierced the storm, a cry thin but alive. Jonas stared at the tiny bundle in his hands, smaller than the rifles he carried, lighter than the axes he swung. A daughter, fragile, perfect. Clara lay back, tears streaking her face, her smile radiant through exhaustion. "She's Grace," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "That's her name, Grace." Jonas's throat tightened as he looked at the child, then at the woman who had brought her into the world in his cabin. Grace, a word he had long forgotten, one he never thought he'd hold in his hands. The storm raged outside, but inside, Jonas felt something crack open. The walls he had built for so many years, stone upon stone, crumbled in the presence of these two lives. He had sought a cook. He had received a woman who carried more strength than any man he'd known, and a child who bore a name that spoke of mercy he thought he had lost forever. For the first time in years, Jonas Hale let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, God had not forgotten him after all. The storm outside finally gave way to a quiet dawn, the kind of silence that comes only after the mountains have spent their fury. Jonas sat near the fire, his broad shoulders bent, his large hands cradling the small bundle that was Grace. Clara slept in the bed he had given her, her face pale but peaceful, the strength of the night still etched in her features. Jonas had known many kinds of weight in his life, the weight of a rifle in battle, the weight of logs on his back, the weight of loss that never left his chest. But none compared to the fragile heaviness of the child against his arm. He stared at her tiny fingers, curling and uncurling as if testing the air, and something inside him broke. Not in pain this time, but in awe. He had paid for a cook, a woman to tend his meals. Instead, he had been handed a daughter, not by blood, but by the grace of heaven itself. When Clara stirred, Jonas moved quickly, setting the child gently against her mother. He felt awkward, unsure, but Clara's tired smile soothed him. "You did well, Jonas," she whispered. "Better than you believe." He only grunted, not trusting himself to speak. But when she laid her head back and drifted to sleep, he sat down again, staring at the fire until his vision blurred. Something had changed in him during that night, something he could not name yet, but knew he could never undo. Days passed into weeks. Grace grew stronger, her cries louder, her tiny fists waving whenever Jonas came near. Clara, though weak at first, slowly regained her strength, moving about the cabin again, though Jonas often ordered her to rest. He hunted longer hours, cut more wood, brought back herbs from the forest after Clara showed him what to look for. For the first time since he could remember, he had a reason to rise each morning beyond survival. But the mountains are not gentle, and they do not soften for love. One bitter morning, as Jonas prepared to set out for hunting, Clara caught his sleeve. "You shouldn't go far today," she said softly. "The sky feels wrong." Jonas looked up. The peaks loomed sharp against the horizon, the clouds moving low and heavy. He had lived long enough among them to know she was right. Still, their food stores were running low. "I won't be gone long," he promised. Hours later, the storm struck sooner than he expected. Snow fell in blinding sheets, the wind cutting like knives. Jonas barely made it back, staggering through the drifts, clutching the rabbit he'd managed to trap. His beard was frozen, his hands numb, but when he shoved the door open, warmth enveloped him. Clara was there, Grace bundled in her arms, her eyes filled with relief. "Never again," she whispered, her voice fierce though her frame trembled. "Don't risk yourself like that for food. We need you alive more than we need meat." Her words, simple but raw, struck him deeper than the cold. No one had spoken to him that way in years, not since his brother. For the first time, Jonas realized he was not alone in the fight to live. His life was no longer only his own. As winter dragged on, they learned one another's rhythms. Clara's quiet determination softened Jonas's rough edges, while his steady presence gave her a security she had not known since before widowhood. He found himself listening to her stories by firelight, of her husband, a kind man taken by fever too soon, of her fear when she discovered she was with child and had nowhere to go. "I thought God had abandoned me," she admitted one night, her gaze fixed on the flames. Every door closed, every hand turned away. But then, this. She looked down at Grace, asleep in her arms, and a tear slid down her cheek. "Maybe he was only leading me here." Jonas shifted uncomfortably, but her words stayed with him long after she fell asleep. He had thought much the same, that God had turned his face from him when his brother was buried in frozen ground. But Clara spoke with a quiet faith that stirred embers he thought long dead. By spring, the mountains softened. Snow melted into rushing streams, the trees pushed out new buds, and with them came new life for the cabin. Jonas built Clara a proper garden near the porch, breaking the ground with his calloused hands, while she planted seeds with care. He built a cradle of smooth pine for Grace, though his fingers fumbled with the carving. Clara laughed when she saw it, her laughter so warm that Jonas felt his chest loosen. But not all neighbors in the wilderness are kind. Word of Jonas taking in a widow and her child spread down the valley. Some men came, rough trappers with too much whiskey in their bellies, curious about the woman now living with the mountain bear. One afternoon, when Jonas was away, two of them came knocking, their voices slick with mockery. Clara stood firm at the door, Grace in her arms, refusing to let them in. When Jonas returned and saw them lingering, something dark rose in him. He didn't raise his rifle, he didn't need to. His sheer presence, towering and unflinching, sent them stumbling back down the trail. That night, as Clara laid Grace in her cradle, Jonas spoke gruffly, "I won't let anyone take what's under this roof. Not from you, not from her." Clara turned, her eyes glistening, and for a moment Jonas thought she might speak words he wasn't ready to hear. But she only nodded, whispering, "I know." Summer came, the air warm, the days long. Grace began to crawl, her giggles filling the cabin like sunlight. Jonas, awkward at first, found himself lying on the floor, letting her tug his beard, her laughter echoing through him like music he'd forgotten existed. Clara watched them with quiet joy, her hands often pausing in their work just to take in the sight. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, Clara stood at the doorway, her hair loose around her shoulders, Grace balanced on her hip. Jonas came up from the field, sweat on his brow, and paused when he saw them, mother and child framed in the golden light. Something clenched in his chest, a longing deeper than hunger, sharper than any wound. He had taken her in as a cook, but she had become more than he could admit. That night, by the fire, Clara finally spoke the words he had feared and longed for. "Jonas, you've given us a home. You've given me safety when I thought I had none left. But you've also given me more. You've shown me a man who carries not only strength, but kindness." He looked at her, his throat thick, his hands rough and unsure. "I don't know if I have kindness in me," he muttered. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "Then what do you think this is?" Her touch was light, but it burned through the years of ice around his heart. He didn't answer, couldn't find the words, but Clara smiled as if she understood anyway. The seasons turned again, another winter, another spring. The cabin that had once been silent now rang with laughter, with the patter of small feet as Grace began to walk, with the sound of Clara's voice singing as she cooked. Jonas, once a man of walls and silence, found himself bowing his head in prayer not out of habit but gratitude. One morning, as he stood on the porch watching the sunrise burn across the peaks, Clara came to stand beside him, her hand slipping into his. He didn't pull away. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time since he could remember, Jonas felt peace. The mountain winds still blew cold, storms still came, and dangers still lurked. But Jonas knew now he did not face them alone. The pregnant widow he had once paid to cook had brought him something no gold could buy: faith restored, a family he never dreamed to have, and a daughter whose very name was the gift he thought lost forever: Grace. And so the mountain man, once hardened by solitude, learned that even the fiercest wilderness can bloom with love when one heart chooses to let down its walls.